before. But are we actually healthier? Obesity, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, osteoporosis, and depression are rife. For the first time in history, chronic illness poses a greater burden on the health of the world than infectious disease. We're talking about 70% of all deaths in the West each year, and it threatens to bring our healthcare system to its knees. The sad fact is this: if you are a healthy adult in today's society, you are in the minority. But none of this makes any sense. With the nonstop procession of celebrity-endorsed diets, health gurus, self-help books, glossy health magazines, and wonder foods and supplements, surely we should be brimming with health. What gives? It's only when we ask the big questions that we uncover the even bigger answers. We find a diet industry that is fanning the flames of the obesity epidemic. Our daily routine of popping vitamin pills is promoting the very diseases they're meant to prevent. A drug industry that has become a catalyst for deteriorating health and pharmaceutical dependence. The media spews a steady stream of half-truths. And our guardians, the government, continue to cling to prehistoric recommendations that allow chronic diseases to spiral. But what if we could change all of this? What if we had the answers to halt the spread of chronic disease in its tracks? What if we had a blueprint for health for you, your family, and for future generations to come?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Health Delusion webinar hosted by Igennus Healthcare Nutrition. It's my absolute pleasure to have with us tonight Glen Matten and Aidan Goggins, the authors of the award-winning book, The Health Delusion. Now, this has just won the Medical Journalists Association Award for the Best Consumer Health Book in 2013. And in my opinion, and the opinion of many other people that have read the book, it's absolutely essential reading for anyone wishing to untangle the complex and confusing web of mixed nutrition and public health messages and the recommendations that are constantly emerging from both the government and the media. It's a really readable and handy guide packed full of tips on what we should really be doing to achieve and maintain optimum health in the 21st century. So I'd like to welcome again Glen and Aidan. Thank you for joining us tonight, gentlemen.
It's a pleasure. What an introduction. Thank you.
How are you
You're
doing?
welcome.
Thanks very much.
So Glen and Aidan are here to talk to us tonight about all of the various topics in their book. They cover everything from what and how much of the range of supplements that you should be taking, the truth of exercise and antioxidants, the right fats, what fats do to us, fetal development, whether or not we should be eating dairy and meat, and even they cover prescription drugs as well as various other really essential topical subjects for achieving health. Aidan and Glen met, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, on the Nutritional Medicine Masters in the University of Surrey. Aidan is a pharmacist by trade originally, and Glen, I believe, has been practicing nutritional therapy after qualifying with the Institute of Optimum Nutrition several years ago. So I'll pass you over to them both just to give you a little bit of introduction onto them and why we're here today. So far away, gents.
I'll take the lead there. Yeah, I'm Glen Matten. I originally trained in nutritional therapy many years ago, and I have a huge belief in the central role of food and nutrition in really transforming the health of individuals and the health of society as a whole, really. It wasn't until I went on to study nutrition much more deeply, much more rigorously, doing a master's degree at the University of Surrey in nutritional medicine, that the penny finally dropped that there were some huge issues we had to get out there. So at the moment I spend my time between private practice in Norwich and London, writing, blogging, and doing work in the media and teaching and lecturing.
Hi guys, it's Aidan here. I think there's actually a bit of a delay here on my end from Dublin, so if you just bear with me. I don't think I can give a better introduction than I just got, as you heard, pharmacist by trade. A bit disillusioned with the whole pharmacy, that when you really get to see patients, that it's more the end of the line kind of stuff, that people with chronic disease and the quite far gone on heavy duty medication. And my interest really is preventative medicine, and you just cannot achieve this without diet and lifestyle intervention. So medicine with diet and lifestyle, a combination to improve therapeutic outcome, that's my main goal.
Fantastic. Now, I think both of you will agree that the reasons behind writing this book were to alleviate some of the frustrations that I'm sure every modern health conscious person has these days. So the book, and indeed the subjects hopefully that we'll cover tonight, looks at the latest evidence-based science on what's really required to stay healthy and reduce our risk of chronic disease in modern living. So we're going to go through the book and pick out some of the key topics, and Glen and Aidan are going to shed light on their thoughts on the real science behind some of these mixed messages we're getting from the public health authorities as well as from the media, and try and learn about some of the truth behind what we should really be doing. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A session. Unfortunately, not everybody can talk to us, but as hopefully you can all see, there is a chat box in the corner of your screen. So if you have any burning questions, please type those down. We'll get through to them either immediately if they're really, really important, or we'll wait until the end and then we can just type away, and Glen and Aidan will be able to answer your questions. So let's fire away. For me, reading your book as both a nutrition consultant as well as working for Igennus, it's very, very clear that there's a lot of mismatched messages out there. So as anyone who cares about public health nutrition, we really want to get down to the bottom of the truth. So can you guys just give me a little overview of your inspiration and your drive behind this book? Why was it so important for you to write The Health Delusion following your master's?
For me, doing the master's degree was, you know, a real sort of watershed in my career, insofar as the closer I got to the actual evidence base, you know, the closer I got to the actual research, without the filter of the media and the, you know, the food industry kind of reinterpreting a lot of these messages. For me, I just realized there was some incredible research being undertaken which really shed light on why we develop many of the illnesses we develop in the 21st century, but that just wasn't really getting out of academia without going through the kind of, you know, manipulation of the media and, you know, a lot of sort of false messages and misleading messages. So really for me the goal was to take this peer-reviewed evidence, you know, this gold standard academic evidence, and deliver it straight to the general public in a way that they could understand, in a way that was honest, had integrity, and properly reflected that research. And unfortunately we're drowning in a sea of misinformation when it comes to health, nutrition and diet. So we were looking to take that evidence, well, I was looking to take that evidence, cut through that and give some really important messages to the people.
A much needed cause. And how about you, Aidan? What was your drive behind writing The Health Delusion with Glen?
See, I've always had an interest in nutrition, but doing pharmacy, just like medicine, your training in nutrition and even preventative medicine is minimal. So instead I used to engross myself in the top selling health books out there, practicing and preaching what they said, but I just always wanted to have a formal qualification to back me up, so I decided to do that master's in nutritional medicine. And truth is, initially I was actually very frustrated because they contradicted so much of what the experts I read about said and what I believed in at the time. And to start, I vehemently believed I was getting lectures from quacks here in the university. But there's only so much evidence you can make excuses for as we got into the intricate and biochemical understandings of health. I realized how much of the mainstream health advice was wrongly given and being complicated by people who simply didn't have the qualifications to understand what they were saying. And the problem it permeates everywhere, from books to the media to even the government policies. The government health advisors are some of the worst culprits for this. So when I got asked to write this book to dispel common myths and to give solutions on achieving great health, I honestly couldn't jump fast enough into doing it.
And a very worthy cause indeed. So obviously you've written this book to tackle some of the frustrations that you both had, and obviously represent a lot of the frustrations of the industry. But very shortly after you published the book, there was an article in the Daily Mail suggesting that perhaps you were a little bit anti-supplementation, and was the message here of the book misconstrued? Were you misrepresented? And what's your real stance on this supplement message?
The Daily Mail article was, you know, it was an interesting experience. The Daily Mail actually ran the exclusive for the book, and rather than sort of giving a very sort of holistic, complete sort of overview of what the book was about, they picked a very specific issue, which was the issue of antioxidant supplements, and how we strongly debunk those. You know, that's an integral part of our book, is sort of debunking the multi-billion-pound antioxidant supplement industry as being really not a good thing for our collective health. And they actually covered that issue very well. They covered that very accurately, and actually done quite a good job of representing the big issues there. Because we do have a problem with antioxidant supplements in that the evidence really doesn't support the routine use of antioxidant supplements, which many people mistakenly, you know, fall into the trap of taking. You know, we just have a little bit of evidence on one of our slides here, which is one of the most famous kind of studies in this area, which clearly shows that, you know, antioxidant supplements significantly increase mortality. You know, things like high doses of beta carotene, vitamin A, vitamin E, you know, really appear not to be good for our health. And the Daily Mail covered that very accurately, in fairness to them. But it kind of led to this idea that somehow the book was highly critical of all nutritional supplements, and that couldn't be further from the truth. We're very pro the appropriate and evidence-based use of nutritional supplements, but that means a lot of the stuff people are doing out there at the moment, we can't condone because we don't think it reflects the evidence. But there are many things people could be doing with supplements to improve their health, which is borne out by the evidence. So we're very much pro the correct use of supplements, but that's only really possible if we understand the evidence. And all the way back in 1931, in the American Journal of Public Health, it was stated that we suffer in this country, particularly from fads, because of the many statements of food experts, and we're definitely not. Well, we're making sure we don't fall into that category. There are many people still, almost a century later, making that mistake. But we're much more focused on what the being driven by the evidence and what the evidence tells us we should be doing, not just the sort of opinion of so-called experts in this field, of which there are many self-proclaimed nutrition experts.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. I mean, looking at the evidence, and I'm sure you'll both agree, there's an awful lot and more emerging daily just to suggest that the wrong recommendations for blanket antioxidant supplementation are causing more problem than good, and this is definitely an area with regard to supplementation that we need to be really careful of as a general public and practitioners. So it is really being pro the right supplements at the right dose. And in your opinion, what do you consider to be the key nutrients that we should be supplementing?
I'll take this, Aidan here. If we realise that supplements will never match the bounty and synergy of nutrients that whole food provides, then we've got to restrict supplements and the purpose of the recommendation, especially for general population recommendations, to those nutrients that for some reason or other are lacking from our diet despite eating an overall nutritionally complete diet. And actually in the UK there's quite a few of them, because what we find is that the UK has quite a record of own goals when it comes to health, with 4 critical nutrients are missing. There'd be selenium, vitamin D, the omega-3s and iodine. I think Glen will talk about vitamin D and omega-3s a bit later, so I'll just give a quick lowdown on selenium and iodine. And then at the end of the webinar I'll give the supplement and the main recommendations, and answer any questions on them. So look at that slide. Yeah, so selenium, what it is an essential trace mineral. It's from the soil, and we actually only need the amount of a single grain of sugar a day to get a sufficient intake. But most of Europe, especially the UK, the soil is so selenium deplete, we actually fall far short of this. And primarily what it does in the body is it increases the activity of a group of chemicals called glutathione peroxidases, which are an essential part of our immune system. And what they do is they control oxidative stress and detoxify cells. So essentially, if we don't have enough selenium, just like in the case of the UK and most of Europe, it's actually impossible for our immune systems to operate optimally, and this increases our rates of inflammatory and autoimmune diseases. And if we look here at the slides, what we can see is we've got hazard ratio for mortality. So this is population death rates across compared to selenium concentrations found in populations. And if we look at the UK, we see an artificially raised death rate above what it should be, because we're selenium deficient compared to what we find in the likes of other countries, including the US. They don't actually have a good reputation for health, but their selenium rate gives them a lower death rate once we account for other confounders. And what we find is that any condition associated with oxidative stress or inflammation can be expected to be influenced by selenium status, and one of these conditions includes cancer. So if we look again at this slide here, we see the UK intakes across a broad range, but in general we're talking about 90% of the population fails to reach the level in the blood which we need for the optimal expression of these glutathione peroxidases, and we don't reach this key serum selenium concentration. So what we look at, if we use a large trial of 1,300 participants, was the the NPC trial, and what they found was that when they correct the selenium status in the population, over a 7-year period there was a 25% reduction in cancer, and prostate cancer halved. You know, this is one intervention and a massive reduction in cancer rates, and there's nothing being done about it. Over 90% of the UK is efficient, and we are each year the amount of cancer deaths as well as inflammatory disease linked to this it's overwhelming that nothing's been done about it. And then the second one would be iodine. What we have is iodine deficiency. Iodine is essential for thyroid hormone synthesis and development of the brain. It's always been a massive issue in pregnancy, because when pregnant, our iodine demands jump 50%, and what that means is most pregnant women actually don't get sufficient iodine to meet the fetal demands. And what we find is iodine is the most common cause of preventable impairment, and children born to iodine deficient women will experience up to a 10 to 15 point reduction in the IQ. So what we actually have in essence is a dumbing down of Britain. But the problem is that while there's a world effort initiated by WHO to address this through iodized salt schemes and increasing the availability of iodized salt available in the shops, the UK has not embraced this. The UK is the only country with no iodized salt scheme, and the UK ranks bottom in the International League of Iodized Salt Availability, with only 3.3% of salt sold being iodized. And the result of this is the UK is now number 8 on the list of the top 10 iodine deficient countries in the world. You've got countries such as Sudan. If we look at the rest of these countries, they're all third world nations practically, and then we've got the UK there sitting among them. And one of the most recent studies actually shows that it's actually getting worse in the UK now. because a study of 14 to 15-year-olds, so the future generation of pregnant women, they showed that 2/3 of them have iodine deficiency. And this is at this stage before the increased demands for pregnancy kick in. So we've got a worsening, where the rest of the world is addressing this issue. We've got a worsening condition in Ireland, and what it is going to do is have drastic economic and cognitive problems for our future generations, where we will in fact get a dumbing down of the population.
Wow, some quite dramatic and scary messages there, and definitely for me, despite my supposed expert nutritional knowledge, the selenium and iodine message is something that I perhaps didn't know anywhere near as much as I should about. So thank you very much for enlightening us on that, Aidan. Glen, do you have anything to add on your key essential supplements?
Yes, I think it all leads nicely into a discussion of vitamin D, really. You know, it was always destined to be a huge part of our book, and we ultimately ended up dedicating 3 whole chapters to the whole vitamin D story, really. So, you know, along with selenium, iodine, we add vitamin D to our list of really important supplements, and already you can see how ludicrous it is to think that we're somehow, you know, branded as anti-supplementation when, you know, we're identifying these huge requirements across nearly the entire population for certain key nutrients. Vitamin D is perhaps the hottest topic in nutritional research of the last decade, and the thing you need to know about vitamin D is that it's the vitamin that we synthesize via the action of sunlight on the skin. It's the sunshine vitamin. Very little is supplied through our diet, and our evolution, we have derived our vitamin D primarily from the sun. That's all very well until we look at the state of affairs in the UK population. As we have a slide here demonstrating, there's, as we all can testify, little sunshine most of the year in the UK. We have a sort of grey, you know, cloudy climate, where because of fears around skin cancer, there's a very proactive campaign for us to stay out of the sun, to cover up, to wear sunblock, and we're all sort of applying our SPF like there's no tomorrow, and that severely restricts our ability to make vitamin D from sunshine. Just by living in the UK, we're not close to the equator. We, even on a sunny day in the UK from October to March, can't synthesize any vitamin D. The sun UVB rays are not of the right quality to make vitamin D. We live in urban environments, we live indoor lifestyles, we have office-based jobs, we play more computer games, we're outdoors less, we have increasing ethnic minority populations in the UK who perhaps have darker skin tone, or their cultural preferences are to sort of stay more fully clothed. And even in the UK we see quite a lot of variation in vitamin D levels. The more northerly parts of the UK experiencing particularly significant problems with vitamin D deficiency. What does all this mean? These factors come together to create a population that has become, due to our modern lifestyles, vitamin D deficient. And estimates are that certainly in the winter months, as many as 90% of the UK aren't getting enough vitamin D. That's all very well. What's the significance of that? Well, evidence is emerging quite strongly. There's a sort of a explosion of research in this field which is showing that not having enough vitamin D may have multiple negative effects on our health. So this little graph just starts to unravel some of that. It's suggested that, you know, higher levels of vitamin D, we think around 75 to 80 nanomoles per litre would be a good sort of level to aim up to. That level is linked with less risk of certain diseases. We'll look at those specific diseases in a minute. Typically in Europe and the US, people are languishing around 54 nanomoles per litre. That's the level of vitamin D in the bloodstream. Maybe that's just enough, barely enough. It's barely enough for most people, but you can see it's proposed that the risk of disease increases as a consequence of that lower level of vitamin D. Where do we find ourselves in the UK? In an even worse situation, with particularly low levels associated with this elevation in disease risk. And it's thought that mortality rates could be increased as much as 26% purely as a consequence of the insufficiency or deficiency of one key nutrient. Hopefully there's a lot going on with this slide, but just to kind of start to unravel that, this is where we should be with a sort of a nice adequate level of vitamin D in the bloodstream. Much of Europe is around this area, 54 nanomoles per litre in the bloodstream. Even jumping from here to here would potentially, it's been estimated, save the EU 187 billion euros in healthcare costs. Where do we find ourselves in the UK? Languishing very low, with significant cost in terms of healthcare expenses, and a whole list of diseases that are either convincingly linked to lack of vitamin D, re-emergence of rickets in the UK, osteomalacia, which is the adult equivalent, osteoporosis, but a whole range of serious chronic ailments now being shown to be linked with lack of vitamin D. Common cancers, diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, heart disease, infections, autoimmune diseases, including things like MS, rheumatoid arthritis, etc. So we see potentially a huge public health problem caused by the deficiency of vitamin D.
Wow, again, a very important and powerful message. I just want to interject for a second, Glenn. One of our listeners has said that she's having a problem with the sound. Is everybody else able to hear us all okay? If people could, I could just have a few yeses in the chat box to let us know that it's not our problem, it's just one of our listeners. Okay, fine. We'll crack on. Sorry to interrupt you there, Glenn. Please carry on with your messages, and I'll see if there's any way.
I think I
needed the interrupting to allow you to breathe. Well, it is a very important message, and going back to just re-emphasize obviously what you've been saying about vitamin D, and then Aidan's information about selenium and iodine. I think many of us forget that being a Western developed and the 7th richest country in the world, supposedly things like deficiency from just everyday nutrients is actually really rife, and it's a big problem. So it's very, very important, and I will let you carry on if you have any other things you wanted to mention that you feel are essential supplements. I've lost you now, Glenn.
Sorry, I'm still here. Sorry, I had a feeling Aidan was going to chip in there. So no, I think I just really echo what you're saying there. We think we live in this age of sophistication and modernisation, and yet we can't even get something as simple as our nutrition right. We have excess food, we have excess calories, we're sedentary, and we're kind of eating ourselves to an early grave, but we're not still able to get the optimal levels of some of these key nutrients. And to me, it's absurd that we live in this age of plenty, in this age of abundance, and we can't even get something as basic as getting our nutrient intake correct. And in many ways we have third world levels when it comes to some of these nutrients, and it's unacceptable.
I couldn't agree more. So that leads us nicely into, you obviously have a very strong feeling about vitamin D, and like you said, it's one of the key messages at the moment. It's got so much funding going into it from all angles. You said already you dedicated 3 chapters of the book to vitamin D. So why do you consider it to be so important, above and beyond what you've already said? And why do you feel that the health messages that have come out so far have failed to get the message across?
I'll carry on, shall I? I'm not sure if Aidan's still with us or not.
Why not?
I hope
Why
he is.
not?
I hope he is. Well, I think what's so interesting about this whole issue is that, you know, we've really gone against nature in many ways by shunning the sun quite as dramatically as we do, or we're encouraged to. And of course, you know, that diet just doesn't provide the vitamin D levels that we need. So, you know, it really leaves us with a problem in a country such as the UK in the winter months, where essentially we experience a vitamin D famine. You know, because where is it going to come from? It's not going to come from the sunshine in the UK in the winter months, because we can't synthesize it. It has to come from somewhere. So there's a huge need for the appropriate use of vitamin D supplements throughout those winter months. The problem is public health messages are stuck in the dark ages, and there's no recognition of this in terms of public health messages. The only people who are encouraged to take vitamin D supplements in this country by the government are pregnant and breastfeeding women and older people over, I think it's 65. Which means, you know, the rest of the population, well, those recommendations are woefully inadequate. They recommend 400 IU per day for those at-risk populations, which, you know, we clearly spell out in the book isn't enough, but it also leaves the rest of the population short. And the evidence is emerging that this isn't just important for our bones, but it's important potentially for a whole raft of modern-day health problems.
Am I right that you quote in your book that actually if you're diagnosed with a number of chronic diseases during the winter months, you're less likely to survive than if you're diagnosed during summer?
Yeah, there's certainly evidence of that. I mean, you know, a lot of this evidence is circumstantial. You know, I think we'd be the first to say with vitamin D there is a need for these more rigorous randomized controlled trials,
of course, yeah.
Of which there are very few in some of these areas we're talking about. But some of the what we would call observational data or even some of the ecological data is startling when you look at the prevalence of things like autoimmune diseases such as MS. We just, you know, see that the further you move away from the equator, so the incidence of some of these autoimmune diseases increases. You know, things like the season of diagnosis of certain diseases will affect the prognosis. So, you know, the evidence is such that, you know, I think we would do well to take this seriously as a public health issue, and it's one that doesn't just affect a minority of people. This affects, you know, the entire population.
We see it in the UK as well. Just within the UK, this difference between disease rates, if we take the example of autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis, we've got Scotland with some of the highest rates in the world, where their latitude means they've got a very short period of the year in which they're able to make vitamin D from the sun, compared to further down in the likes of London and that. And there has been documented differences in the disease rates between these two areas of Britain, and it goes beyond dietary differences, increases in smoking, alcohol, and it's actually known as the Scottish paradox. If we get back to why the lack of government action, one of the actual reasons is it's such a big issue. It's too big for recommendations to come out. If we take the recommendation from the US government there just over a year ago, where they say that the minimal levels needed for health are 20 nanogram per milliliter, this would mean that over half the UK population is deficient. So the UK government can't come out and say people at risk need to supplement because the majority of the population are deficient in vitamin D. It would mean that there would have to be a universal plan, either universal supplementation provided by the government, a fortification plan of some type, it would have to go beyond the recommendation. The government would have to intervene, and because such an effort would be required, this is why it's such a slow acting on the government's behalf to interact, even though they are looking at it. And that's why we are still left with a recommendation from 1993 on vitamin D intake, which was introduced before we realised that vitamin D receptors existed anywhere else in the body except for on bones.
I think definitely it's a big problem when it comes to government recommendation. There's a big gap, isn't there, when between saying this is what people should be doing and then saying, right, things have gotten so bad, we need to do something about it. And as you say, with the vitamin D message, it's reached that point now where realistically the majority of people, particularly in Northern Europe and the UK, are effectively deficient, and it is starting to have a huge impact on our health. So I couldn't agree more. There's still currently this big mismatch, and in order to actually make changes, big things need to happen from the government. So if that is the case, what's your recommendation for people in terms of safe sun exposure when there's enough sun, and then the right amount of vitamin D? What times of year should you be supplementing in order to make sure that people are doing their utmost to avoid any health-related problems?
Over the winter months, which we would broadly suggest is October through until the end of March. For adults, we recommend a daily vitamin D supplement of 1,100 to 1,200 IU per day. And this really was born from our analysis of the data and evidence as to what dose would get the majority of people within what we consider to be a desirable and ideal range for vitamin D throughout those months. In the summer months, we think that safe sun exposure is adequate for most people to maintain their vitamin D levels at ideal level, and that doesn't involve ever getting sunburn. It doesn't involve spending hours sunbathing. It's possible to make significant amounts of vitamin D through very short exposure to the sun towards the middle of the day, when vitamin D synthesis is greatest. So really it's this idea of little and often, small amounts of sun exposure on a regular basis, never getting sunburn, never going red in the sun, always being sort of exercising common sense, and that seems to be a way to maximize the benefits whilst minimizing the risks of, obviously, things like skin cancer. It will vary. We don't give any very specific recommendations about how much sunshine to have, because it will obviously vary according to skin tone. So if you have lighter skin, you'll make vitamin D more quickly, but also you'll burn more quickly. So that's going to be very different to somebody with darker skin tone. We also know that other variables will affect this, such as age. So as we get older, our ability to synthesize vitamin D from sunshine declines and diminishes. So there will be lots of variables that affect this, but as a broad general rule, we recommend supplementation with those levels I mentioned in the winter months, and safe, common sense sun exposure during the summer months. We have a slide that will give those details at the end.
Lovely. Well, we'll move on now for vitamin D. I hope we've answered a couple of the questions that did pop up in the box earlier. If not, as I said, there'll be a chance to ask a few more at the end, hopefully. So let's talk about fat next. Fat seems to be another one of these really gone horribly wrong public health messages that's just starting to emerge, shall we say, recently. What is the truth about fat? Should we be reducing our intake, or is this perhaps the biggest public health message ever given, essentially? And if so, why is it so dangerous to reduce fat intake or even recommend fat intake reduction?
Yeah, in my opinion, this is probably the most damaging health message that we receive that affects the Western world. If we look at this slide here, these are the fats. We've been told that fats are bad for us, and these are the main dietary sources that occur naturally. And the thing that really gets me is, I mean, this message is so absurd that I just leave science aside for a minute and just ask people to use common sense. I mean, our health woes, they've sprung upon us in the last 60 years or so. But what we're being told the secret to good health is to reject the diets that we've eaten for thousands of years, and now to embrace this new, era of processed foods or modified foods which have the fats taken out of them. That the likes of the naturally occurring meats, dairies, nuts, oils, that these supposedly, in the last few decades, have supposedly become bad for us. And then if we look at an example of just how badly it's being manipulated, if we keep a picture in our mind of what we've been told is bad for us, this is what we've been told is good for us, the replacement. It's an example
Nice.
I've seen here just the other
Looks
day.
like
Yeah, so these are holy
like
donuts.
of many people I know.
And why not? They're the ultra low-fat gourmet donuts and cinnamon buns created by Holy Donuts and prepared in such a way that you'll be able to eat them without any worry at all. They've been promoted by People Magazine, Time Magazine, The Rachel Ray Show, Whoopi Goldberg Show, and numerous others. And they're also doctor recommended by doctors on the American Medical Association. Now, of course, there is a fact that if there's no fat in them, they need something else to replace the fat with. And what we get in one single large donut, it's 68 grams of carbohydrate, which is refined flour and sugar. And the sugar content is 7 added teaspoons of sugar per donut. And this is what we have been told. This is what we have been told is the healthy replacement. So, science aside, it's just a simple question. To what we know, common sense aside, which do we actually think is healthier for us? The natural occurring fats or the replacements that we're being offered? And then it's an obvious one, but we will look at the actual what the scientific evidence shows. So in 2010 there was a meta-analysis. There was 21 studies of nearly 350,000 people. And what they found was there was no evidence that saturated fat was linked to the coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease increases. In a large Japanese population, those who had the lowest saturated fat intake had the highest occurrence of cardiovascular disease. And we know from studies that if we take 5% of energy from saturated fat, which is what government guidelines are to reduce our energy intake of saturated fat by 5%, replace them with carbohydrates, which are the current recommendations, we will see a 7% increase in coronary events. And when we restrict them carbohydrates to high glycemic index carbohydrates, we get a 1/3 increase in the occurrence of heart attacks. So the problem is that at the moment we're so narrow-sighted. We seem to think it's all about cholesterol. And back in the 50s, there was a medical researcher called Keyes, and it showed that saturated fat causes raised LDL, the bad cholesterol increases, where carbohydrate reduces it. So the obvious conclusion was to replace saturated fat with carbohydrate. But it goes so much further than this. And what we find is our carbohydrate intake, especially refined carbohydrates, so this includes sugar, but not just sugar, it includes all the white and beige and processed foods that we eat. So we're talking about potatoes, rices, pastas, breads, things like this which we think are a staple and a healthy contribution to our diet. What we find is that they increase our insulin levels dramatically, promote inflammation, cause oxidative stress, increase levels of low density LDL, and increase our triglyceride levels. So it's no wonder that the message for replacing fat with carbohydrates has been an absolute disaster. And just last week, we got a classic example of a landmark randomized controlled trial that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And participants here were asked to switch from a traditionally recommended low-fat diet to a Mediterranean diet, which was high in fats through the intake of nuts or olive oil. And what they found was there was a whopping 30% reduction in the occurrence of major cardiovascular events in individuals without cardiovascular disease but a high risk of getting it. The main changes were a hefty increase in fat intake, and participants were told to eat naturally and not to calorie count.
Very interesting stuff on the message about fats. It's just so crazy that we're being recommended to reduce our fat intake, and as you said there, that this has actually come on the basis of someone decades ago who went, oh, we get cholesterol and we get fat in the arteries and that leads to heart disease, so it must be the problem. But hopefully everyone should slowly be getting the message that actually this is really quite wrong. When it comes to fats, one type of fat in particular has been given a lot of attention, and this is our polyunsaturated fatty acids, namely our omega-3s and our omega-6s. Can you just go into a little bit more depth for people about why these have quite profound and different roles within the body and why it's so important to get the balance right?
I think this is such a intriguing area and something that is potentially portrayed as being such a simple issue actually is not quite as simple as we're led to believe. I'll just start by just explaining broadly the different types of fats we eat. Aidan has mentioned the saturated fats, perhaps somewhat more maligned than they should be, and actually perhaps not the sort of dietary villain that they've been portrayed as, but they're traditionally seen as bad fats, you know, albeit that we might heavily question that conclusion. And then we have what we might refer to as sort of better fats, the unsaturated fats. On the one hand, we have monounsaturated fats. These would be very much the types of fats Aidan was referring to in a Mediterranean-style diet, rich in things like olive oil. And then we have the polyunsaturated fats, which are the ones that are heavily pushed in favour of saturated fats by current healthcare messages. And that's all very well, except there's a whole story to unravel around polyunsaturated fats. And the important point here is that there are two polyunsaturated fats are not just one thing. There are two families, two separate families, the omega-6 and the omega-3. And not only that, each type of fat is a family of fats within itself. So within omega-6 fats, we have different types of fats. Within the omega-3 family of fats, we have different types of fats. And that's actually incredibly important to know. The reason being is that you need both of these fats. Both are completely essential to human health. The problem being that modern diets contain plentiful amounts of omega-6 fats, and there's no shortage of those in Western diets. But alas, typically modern diets can be very deficient in the omega-3 family of fats, notably these very potent types of omega-3 called EPA and DHA. So just to put it in sort of context, if we look at traditional hunter-gatherer diets, they might have somewhere between 1 to 2 times the amount of omega-6 to the amount of omega-3. So fairly equal amounts, you know, not hugely disparate. If we look at typical Western diets, that ratio might be anywhere between 10 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3, or in some diets, and I'm sure it's possible to find those, it might be as bad as 30 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. So very distorted diets in terms of the different levels of omega-6 relative to omega-3. Now, we don't think the ratio matters that much. What we need to do is get away from worrying too much about that and starting to boost intake of this family of fats, specifically these very potent EPA and DHA fish oils. The reason being is our diets are woefully low, woefully lacking these very powerful omega-3 fats. Typical intakes around about 100 milligrams per day in typical British or typical Western diets. Only 19% of people meet recommended intakes for fish consumption. We have about 100 milligrams per day on average. The minimum we need for cardiovascular health, everybody agrees, is at least 500 milligrams per day. We're woefully short in these powerful omega-3 fats. So there's a very strong message that if we are to talk about polyunsaturated fats, we need to be a bit more savvy, and we need to accept that there's already plenty of omega-6 in our diets, and we need to start encouraging people to consume more of these fish-based omega-3 fats.
So it seems that EPA and DHA, as you said, the marine fish-based oils, seem to be the heroes of the day when it comes to balancing out modern diets. But why exactly are these so important? What's the significance of these two specific omega-3s in terms of health in modern living?
It's when we start to look at what these fats do that it becomes apparent that being as deficient as we are in these fats is going to cause us a lot of health problems. They're really important for cardiovascular and heart health. Just under a gram per day of these marine-based fish oils have been shown to reduce death, non-fatal heart attack and non-fatal stroke by about 15% in post-heart attack populations. They, in terms of cardiovascular health, they help to stabilize the electrical activity of the heart. They're anti-thrombogenic, which means they discourage blood clotting. They're anti-inflammatory. They have a modest effect on lowering blood pressure, and they can have quite powerful effects on lowering levels of triglycerides in the bloodstream. So for cardiovascular health, they're an essential dietary component. Moving beyond that, we see that they play an important role in balancing inflammation in the body. EPA, this omega-3 fish oil here, competes with this omega-6 fat called arachidonic acid. This is a this gets metabolized into a whole range of pro-inflammatory chemicals in the body. EPA gets metabolized into much less inflammatory components in the body. So by upping this, we can provide a natural counterbalance to this inflammatory fatty acid. And that's important because if we look at the literature that's emerging on many of our chronic illnesses in the 21st century, there's an inflammatory component to many of them. This idea of low-grade chronic inflammation as a driver of things like neurodegenerative diseases. Obesity has an inflammatory component, type 2 diabetes, common cancers, and obviously overt inflammatory disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis, where there is evidence that if you give the right amounts of EPA and DHA, you can actually dampen down some of this inflammatory activity that's going on. And aside from the cardiovascular and the anti-inflammatory benefits, these fish oils in their respective ways, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss, may have a very important role to play in the health of the brain, the development of the brain, and such things as our mood and our predisposition to mental health problems and even dementia later in life. So this idea that fish is brain food, I think, is very much borne out when we look at the specific roles of these fats.
Okay, so quite important there. You are fading in and out a little bit, Glenn. So if I can just ask you to make sure you're shouting into your microphone, then hopefully
Okay,
everyone will be able to read you loud and clear from the other end.
I've
So you touched
repositioned.
there on you touched there on a number of different things that particularly EPA and DHA are really important in, namely cardiovascular health as well as inflammation, and then things like brain development, dementia, and even mental health. Is it particularly important that people with dietary restriction, for example, vegans, pay a real focus on getting their EPA and DHA levels? And what would be the best sources for people who do limit animal produce in their diets in order to achieve optimal levels?
It's a very good question and one we hear frequently. The problem we find with vegan diets or plant-based diets, which are very healthy in many ways, there's lots of positive things to be said about those types of diets, but in certain areas they can fall down. The types of fats we'll find in those diets are predominantly plant-based fats, which are either the omega-6 fat linoleic acid or the omega-3 fat alpha-linolenic acid. Now, if you're having some plant-based omega-3 in the diet, you're then relying on the body to convert it down this pathway into the more potent EPA and DHA. Alas, human beings are not very good at making that conversion. It's inefficient. Very modest amounts get converted to EPA and only tiny amounts ever get converted to DHA. So we're not efficient at making this conversion happen. This is a problem potentially of plant-based diets. And what do we see? Studies of British men have shown that vegans have EPA levels that are 53% lower than people who eat a meat-based diet or fish diet including sort of meat and fish, and their DHA levels have been shown to be 59% lower. So when we talk about these broad benefits of these fats, we can see that consuming a wholly plant-based diet could mean deficiency in these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. So that raises important practical questions. What can be done about it? One of the things we know is that if you cut down the amount of omega-6 linoleic acid in the diet and up the amount of alpha-linoleic acid, which you might do by switching to things like flaxseed oil or having rapeseed oil, you actually encourage this pathway a little bit more. So it helps push things down this pathway by changing the balance of these fats, encouraging more of the plant-based omega-3s. Another way is to tackle the problem from the other end, and it is possible to buy supplements of DHA, which are derived from algae and are therefore suitable for vegetarians. And not only does that provide a direct source of DHA, but some of that DHA can be retro-converted back to EPA. So it is a challenge. It is something that people consuming plant-based diets need to be aware of, and there are strategies that can help at least boost and enhance the levels of those important omega-3 fats.
So it's not all doom and gloom if you're a veggie or a vegan. Thankfully, there are ways of sorting things out. And as you say, the retroconversion of supplementing with DHA and obviously increasing ALA in the diet can really help. You touched earlier on the role of omega-3s in mental health, so I just want to go into that in a little bit more depth because, as I'm sure a number of you are aware, when it comes to mental health, actually today it's one of the NHS's biggest expenses. 1 in 4 of us are considered to be suffering from mental health disorder at any one point, and the outgoings to support people with mental health actually exceed the costs of both cardiovascular disease and cancer put together currently. Now, I think this is something really quite dramatic because mental health today is still considered quite a taboo. And I think a lot of people don't realize that mental health can actually be a dietary associated problem. Can you just shed a little bit of light and a bit more detail on what you were saying about the role of omega-3s, particularly EPA and DHA, in mental health disorders?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is such an intriguing area, and an area where, again, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and without reading the literature and understanding the evidence, it's easily to get the wrong end of the stick with this particular issue. One of the things we often don't realise is, although EPA and DHA are structurally very similar, in terms of how they work in the body, they're quite different. So DHA, we would tend to think, is important at certain stages of life, namely for the infant's developing brain, so in pregnancy and the very early years, where there's a lot of structural building taking place of the brain. DHA is an important structural building block of the brain. And also the evidence suggests that DHA, again, may have a particularly important role to play later in life in potentially warding off things like dementia. But EPA has an altogether different story to tell. So rather than being a structural building block for things like the brain, EPA actually appears to be more important for the functioning of things. And what we see is increasing evidence to show that EPA may have an important role to play in mental health problems. And here we're talking about things like depression, and possibly even behavioural problems such as ADHD in children. One of the areas this is so confusing is because much of the studies, many of the studies that are conducted, don't really differentiate between the two fats. They just give fish oils to people and see what happens to them with their depression. But actually, it looks as though if you separate out these studies and look at the ones that give either only EPA in things like depression, or mostly EPA and not much DHA, you start to see a very different picture. And you start to see evidence that EPA-rich supplements may have an important role to play. I'll just show you some evidence to illustrate how the evidence stacks up for something like depression. Famously, it's been shown that there's a strong correlation between the amount of fish a nation consumes and the prevalence of depression. In countries that eat lots of fish, like Japan, the overall prevalence is low. In westernized countries where the consumption of fish is low, we see much higher rates of depression. Even within countries, eating more fish correlates with less chance of having depressive symptoms. And when depressed patients have been studied, we find that they show lower levels of omega-3 in their bloodstream, and the lower the level, typically the worse their symptoms of depression. None of this proves anything. It's all circumstantial evidence, but it's very compelling and very interesting. When proper, rigorous randomized controls have been conducted, they've shown mixed results. Why? The question we beg, why is this? And it's because there hasn't been a proper differentiation between EPA and DHA. When we look at the studies that use primarily EPA in clinical trials for depression and put those together, we find that supplements that contain at least 60% EPA or more show benefit, whereas supplements that contain low levels of EPA and more DHA are ineffective. So there's a very clear message there that high EPA fish oil supplements appear to be the important component in terms of mental health problems such as depression. We're starting to see similar evidence for conditions such as ADHD as well. EPA seems to be the functionally important fatty acid if we're going to tackle some of these mental health problems through a nutritional strategy.
Wow, so there really does seem to be quite an emerging role for specific nutritional elements in terms of therapeutic benefits, to the point even where it could be considered as good as a common medication. I think you'll hopefully agree with me, Glenn, in saying that there's research to suggest that the use of EPA is as effective, if not more effective, than antidepressant medication and even ADHD medication, and particularly in people who have been previously unresponsive to normal pharmaceuticals. Am I correct in my statements?
I think, yeah, I think, you just raised such a salient point in that, you know, sort of nutrition and pharmacy and drugs. I'm sure Aidan will have more to say on this shortly, but they're sort of seen as somehow mutually exclusive, and nutrition's just not getting a look in really. And we know that many of these drugs for depression aren't miracles. They're not particularly effective. There are many patients who don't derive benefits. There are many patients who discontinue their treatment because of side effects or through simply not deriving benefit. And I think we're really passionate to see a new era in how some of these conditions are treated, where nutritional protocols are integrated and stand alongside conventional treatment protocols. And EPA appears to be potentially important, especially when we consider some of the what we would call comorbidities of things like depression. People who suffer depression are also at increased risk of other chronic health problems, such as heart disease. Well, the mere act of improving the omega-3 intake of that individual, whether or not it helps their depression, which we think it might, may well have systemic health benefits, which are not to be overlooked. And of course, there are other nutritional links in with sort of mood and mental health and brain function, which can enrich a nutritional strategy aimed at sort of improving the treatment of patients.
So, I mean, this is a nice message for consumers, because increasingly we see more and more people wanting to move away from pharmaceuticals. As you say, there's so many contraindications associated with taking drugs these days. People are always trying to move away. Well, not everybody, but lots of people, and the increasingly health conscious people are starting to realize that just paying a little bit more attention to diet and lifestyle can allow you to essentially live a life pharmaceutical free. It can take a while, obviously, but what are your thoughts on this, Aidan? I mean, is there a way that we can ultimately use nutrition with pharmaceuticals in people that need to be taking them to improve the effective nature of pharmaceuticals and eventually come off them completely?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to stick with chronic disease here. And for me, it's always to search for the root of the problem and not to just try and band-aid on it. And dysfunctions exist, and correcting them through medicine is a necessity, especially if it's something like a hormonal issue. Because no amount of diet and lifestyle changes will adequately compensate for, say, example, insufficient thyroid levels. And just like with nutritional supplements, it's key to put back whatever is missing in the body. And if medicine is needed to do this, then that's what should be done. Well, if we look at medicine as a quick fix to years of neglect in the diet and lifestyle, I mean, this is an extremely slippery slope. I mean, how many of you would drive a car like this, or with issues on it, would just tape it up and do the bare minimum to just keep going? I mean, you wouldn't be caught dead driving that, but yet so many of us can be allegorized through that to how we treat our actual own bodies. Sorry, I've just got a crazy echo there. I'm back. If we go back, if we go back for a second, just say to the Mediterranean diet that we looked at, that randomized controlled trial published last week, we saw that those on it had a 30% less serious cardiovascular events compared to a low-fat diet. Well, what if we reverse it and call the Mediterranean diet the normal, the way we should be eating, as nature dictates? And then those in the low-fat diet are actually experiencing a 43% increase in serious cardiovascular events above what they should be. And then this is where drugs will be used, and unnecessarily slow, so to bring down these rates back to the normal of what a good diet brings. And this is exactly what's happening with an issue that I've serious contentions with, and it's called the polypill. And it's the initial proposal that a combination of 5 drugs, and 4 now, aspirin, statin for cholesterol, and 2 blood pressure lowering drugs, should be given to everyone over the age of 50 to reduce heart disease. In fact, it's being estimated that heart disease will be effectively eradicated, and its founder has suggested that no other preventative method would have so great an impact on public health in the Western world. But as we've seen in just as we said with the Mediterranean diet, we know that diet can reduce heart disease effectively, and we know that certain foods, there's a food here, this example here on the left hand side of the screen here, it's what's called the polymeal, and researchers put an article in the British Medical Journal shortly after the polypill was suggested, and they showed that a diet rich in garlic, fruit and vegetable, red wine, nuts, dark chocolate and fish would produce the same effects as this pill. So once again, what we're looking at is a society that's endorsing medication taking to compensate for flaws in policy and flaws in recommendations in our dietary intake. So I mean, if we give you a quote by the Polypill Committee, what they say is changing lifestyles is hard to achieve in current social and political climates. And I've got just such a major problem with that. I mean, how can we as people who want good health actually accept this, an admittance that we've got it wrong, but since so much work, effort and egg on the face to admit it, instead of changing policy, let's put it as it is and drug people and bring them back to where proper dietary guidelines would have in the first place. And then we've got this big issue as well of what after heart disease. I mean, after the polypill, which is just restricted to heart disease, what about the next diseases of diabetes, cancer, osteoporosis and the likes? We know that healthy eating is holistic. We know that a diet that reduces heart disease is also an anti-inflammatory diet. We know it's also an anti-cancer diet. We know boosts bone strength. We know it provides brain support, immune support, etc. But when we look at the polypill, the only additional effects aside from the reduction in heart disease, where 1 in 6 experienced side effects, and 1 in 20 the side effects were so bad that they had to cease therapy.
Crazy. It's just, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. To have a designer of a pill come along and say, just blanket everyone over 50, give them a drug and we'll save loads of lives, above and beyond saying, well, do you know what? If we just do a little bit more to implement a healthy, functional eating regime, we could save a lot more lives. And this, I think, is the real message, isn't it, from the Health Delusion and from more and more public health messages that are emerging, that we really need to stop and take stock and rethink the way we're working, essentially, and realize that the human body was built to last. It was built to work. It was built to be functional, but actually we're not giving it what it needs. And without readdressing those issues, we're never going to get back to the healthy, happy, functional human society that we're supposed to be. So you guys have covered a lot of really, really key subjects with us tonight, and thank you very much for going through all of that. But just as a summary for everybody, can both of you give me your top tips for achieving health and longevity in the 21st century?
Yeah, sure. For me, it's diet-wise, it's a 3-stage process. I mean, I think we've got to start off back at a grassroots level, back to common sense, back to intuitive eating. And I think one of the best questions that we can ask ourselves is, was it around in Grandma's day? And if that food group didn't exist back then, then we've got to raise serious queries about it and, you know, justify its inclusion in our diet. We also need to ensure that we keep our diets plant-rich. And I think a good guide is to use the rainbow guide. So the more colours that you can incorporate into your diet, so away from all this monotonous beige and white foods that, you know, that are commonplace now, the more colour in the diet, the better it's going to be for you. And then once we got that basic covered, then we notch it up a level and we can say, okay, do we need foods for certain conditions? Like, if we are at risk of prostate cancer, maybe then we should focus more on lycopene-rich foods and the likes of processed tomatoes and egg yolks and foods like that. Do we have a family history of age-related macular degeneration, for example, with IDs? Then we can say that we should maybe focus on green leafy vegetables, you know, which are rich in lutein and zeaxanthin. And then, can I make clever swaps? You know, instead of going for crisps, you know, which we know are rich in refined carbohydrates, increase insulin resistance, increase fat deposition, increase triglycerides, as well as rich in acrylamide, which is a cancer-forming agent. Maybe swap for popcorn, which is actually a plant rich in phytonutrients. Can we switch our black tea to green tea, which has been shown in numerous studies that that switch will enhance our cancer protection? We see in Japan, green tea is their favorite tea over there. Maybe we take a lesson from them. Our chocolate, can we even up the cocoa levels in the chocolate we buy? Because we know cocoa is beneficial for us, but most of the chocolate has so much of it removed, replaced with sugar, that we don't actually get the hard, rich benefits that we should be. And then we go to the dietary rise, we take it up that very last level, and we replace what's missing, and we add, and you say, am I covering natural food types, or do I need to supplement? So as Glen mentioned earlier, if you're vegetarian, then you know you're going to have low omega-3s. Then maybe it would be a very good idea for you to take an algae DHA supplement of about 300 milligrams each day. Then, yeah, as we mentioned already, we have selenium. Selenium should be taken, we don't get that in the diet, it should be taken in the yeast form. So we know the recommendations are, because it's so potent in prostate cancer, men should take 100 micrograms per day, where women only need to take 50 to 60 micrograms per day. Vitamin D3, Glen already covered it, 1100 to 1200 international units per day in the winter. As we see, iodine is a massive issue now, especially for vegetarians, because its food sources are fish, seafood, milk, dairy, and eggs. So we should be encouraged to increase the uptake of these products. But if you're adverse to them, or if you're pregnant where your demands increase dramatically, then we need to supplement the likes of 150 microgram supplement each day. And then as we mentioned before, that you know, chronic disease is not to be treated with plasters and band-aids, but there are legitimate reasons for taking drugs. And if that is the case, then we ask, can we complement that drug therapy with nutrition? We know that certain low-dose aspirin, we know that actually a very effective drug for heart health, but we know that there's a certain percentage of the population that are aspirin resistant. It means they don't get the benefits from low-dose aspirin. So they need to increase the dose from 75 milligrams a day to 300 milligrams a day. But the problem with this is they experience a massive increase in the risk of gastrointestinal bleeding from this dose increase. But if we take our 75 milligrams of aspirin and add in fish oils, which also have blood thinning effects, what we do is we see the same benefits from the increased dose of aspirin by using fish oils instead of upping the dose. The same can be said for a lot of drug side effects. They're often due to nutrient depletion. So we know that, for example, for antacids, acid suppressing drugs are now linked dramatically with big increases in fractures with bone disease. So we recommend for people to make sure their vitamin D replete when they're on that, and as well to supplement magnesium, because we know antacids now can deplete the body of magnesium. We also know that antacids can lower our B12 levels, so we recommend adding back in B12. So these are the kind of questions that we need to do on a tailored individual level, but we can only ever do these things after we get the grassroots and, you know, levels right, common sense, go back to basics. And then, of course, even though we focused on diet through this whole thing, we can't, you know, leave out its partner staying active. No amount of diet and a healthy diet will compensate for a lack of physical activity. This is pertinent to be included as part of a healthy lifestyle.
I couldn't agree more with you there, Aidan. Exercise really is, again, one of the key things emerging as having above and beyond effect on health and well-being than diet alone, and it's really important that people start to heed to that message. Yes, you can go a long way with a good diet, but if you're sedentary, then you're still in trouble, and actually you can outweigh a lot of the negative impact of a bad diet if you are relatively active and meeting at least the minimum recommendations from the government. Do you have anything you wanted to add there, Glen, on just your key points of achieving health and happiness?
I think what Aidan's covered there is really comprehensive, and I think the only thing I would wish to add is that it's you put all that together, and you're putting a lot of bits of the jigsaw puzzle together that are required for exceptional health. The problem people have, and it's not their fault, it's just the nature of, you know, the way the media works and the food industry works, is we think in very compartmentalized ways about our health. We're looking for the next kind of fad supplement. We're looking for the next superfood. We're looking for the next, you know, weight loss diet, and we're just kind of looking for some kind of elixir or some, you know, holy grail that will solve all our health problems. That's never going to happen if we don't embrace a truly holistic approach to our whole diet, not single foods, whole diet. Much more savvy and intelligent use of supplements. Let the evidence guide us on how we should use supplements. Forget the hype, forget the marketing. And, you know, let's do what human beings are supposed to do and be active and you know, actually derive the benefits from activity. So put all that together, and it's an incredibly powerful synergistic approach to good health. And ultimately, I would suggest an incredibly exciting and empowering message for anybody who really does care about their health and the health of their family.
Well, thank you both very much. A really, really insightful and mind-shatteringly broad amount of information to take in there, but all very profound, and despite how slightly overwhelming it may seem at first, it's actually quite simple messages. If anybody does want to know more or would like any more detail on the subjects that Glen and Aidan have covered this evening, The Health Delusion is definitely the way forward. The book's available to buy through us here at Igennus, but also through Glen and Aidan's websites, The Health Uncut and The Health Delusion. We should hopefully have a little bit of time just to answer a few questions. I do have a couple written down from earlier that you might just be able to cover quickly. Jane asked earlier in the evening about calcium supplementation. Should she be supplementing calcium, and if so, how much?
Shall I go on that one, Aidan? Are you happy for me to give an answer?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
We don't actually recommend calcium supplementation for the vast majority of people. In actual fact, emerging evidence shows us that the inappropriate use of calcium, you know, sort of just giving high dose calcium for the prevention of osteoporosis, seems to increase the risk of heart disease. So it's certainly not it's not one of the nutrients we're terribly focused on. Of course, it does have a role to play in bone health, but it's not a supplement that we endorse people take unless they have a very good reason to take it.
Okay, lovely. I think on the calcium front, there are actually certain types of calciums that are available, some derived from algae, which eliminate the cardiovascular contraindications. So for people, like you say, that are at risk of osteoporosis or low calcium status, then that is definitely an option to look into. Another
I
question
think
we
the
had
problem
was
with
from Thomas. Sorry.
calcium. I think the problem with calcium is what we're seeing is
Go
that
on.
we're focusing once again on a sole nutrient and not a synergy of nutrients that we
Yes.
get like in the diet. And the problem here is it's not calcium per se that is causing these heart attacks. It's the imbalance of calcium to other nutrients. So people are solely taking calcium.
Yes.
High amounts of calcium with vitamin D deficiency is incredibly bad for our health. Then if we look at the other nutrients
Yes.
involved in the bone matrix, we need magnesium, we need vitamin K, and it's only when we get these right, see what we do is we over-focus on calcium and neglect these other nutrients. So it's definitely essential to get sufficient calcium in the diet, but we can't compensate for nutrients that are missing elsewhere through extra calcium. This only ever causes problems.
Yes, I agree, definitely. We need to be really, really careful, and it goes back to the slide that Glenn showed earlier, looking at the omega pathways, and actually down the side of that slide, there were all of the cofactors and vitamins and minerals that you need in order to process the fats effectively. And it's the same with any vitamin. Once you up something, you need to up everything else that goes along with it in order to actually make sure that you can process it. So definitely a very key message there. Another question we had was Thomas mentioned he'd watched a documentary on tap water and was wondering if the dangers of fluoride supplementation that were mentioned were exaggerated or whether this is something that people should be considering.
I can go here if you want. I'm not too much of an expert on fluoride, but here in Dublin we do have fluoridated water, and the dentists are adamant that the difference between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in the tea quality is just dramatic, and that is why they continue to voice their approval for the fluoridation. I think there is legitimate concerns of if the fluoride builds up, we know it is toxic. The question is whether through tap water will these amounts reach in the body. And all I can say is what I do myself is I do drink tap water, but not excessive amounts, and I use it for cooking. But a lot of my water comes from spring water as well.
So as with many nutrition messages, it's moderation, basically. Don't go too far with anything. And probably in countries where tap water does have a fluoride content, then we don't want to be supplementing fluoride on top of that. So one last question I have at the moment was just going back to the vitamin D message, and this was Danielle asking this one. Is it safe for children to take vitamin D supplements, and if so, roughly how much should they be aiming for?
We think it's equally important for children to take vitamin D. The only caveat there being that they're much smaller and they don't require the same doses as adults. So it really depends on the age. Certainly when we look at exclusively breastfed infants, we think there's a huge gap where there should be more proactive supplementation of vitamin D, perhaps 300 to 400 IU per day. Many formulas, infant formulas, already have the vitamin D added. So in formula-fed infants, that's already provided by the formula. So breastfed infants are a sort of separate case really, where breast milk is inherently low in vitamin D, and especially in the winter months, exclusively breastfed infants may be at high risk of vitamin D deficiency. So that's important. As they get older, then yes, perhaps children of sort of school age will require a vitamin D supplement in the winter months, and depending on the age, that might be somewhere between sort of 400 to 800 IU, and as they get closer to sort of late teens, then the adult dose would apply. So it's just using a modicum of common sense in terms of dosing and scaling down the dose according to the age and body size. Would you have anything
just to add in there?
Okay. Go ahead, Aidan. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, bit of a lag here, but yeah, just to add in there, we see this family history of autoimmune disease. So that makes the dosing of vitamin D even more important to try and reach that upper end of the spectrum of the recommended dosing, which is about 28 to 32 nanograms per millimeter. So at some stage, it would be recommended that she gets that there are blood tests taken to measure the vitamin D levels to see how they respond to the dose that they're on. Because you've got to remember, these doses are what the average level will be reached, but there will be a wide spectrum of response.
And that's probably an important take-home message. Sorry, Glenn. I was just going to say that's quite an important.
Go ahead.
It's quite an important message for a number of supplements that you probably haven't mentioned as necessary for blanket UK usage, is that if there are always going to be some people that are deficient in other things, and it's important in those cases to get tested and figure out what your levels are to work out exactly what and how much you need. Sorry, Glenn, go ahead. I've interrupted you.
I was merely going to echo your point and say the thing about vitamin D is without testing levels, it's guesswork. And we've had a good guess at what we think we'll do for most people, but actually I think we could both happily, confidently say we would like to see more proactive testing of people's vitamin D levels, especially where they're at risk of or have a disease or illness that is linked on some level with vitamin D deficiency. And we would love to see an era of much more proactive vitamin D testing.
Okay, well, I think that's covered everybody's questions so far. Glen and Aidan are both available through their website if you want to get in touch with any questions afterwards. Alternatively, you can email
I just
us
add
at
in
Igennus.
2 points of
yes, go
just
ahead.
to say, and I think I will definitely conclude that we're not anti-supplement in the right context. And we discussed selenium supplements and iodine supplementation. Just for a take-home message, because you will often see in the media, you'll often see recommended, for example, that selenium needs can be met by Brazil nuts, by eating 2 to 3 Brazil nuts a day. We just want to make sure that we don't endorse this recommendation. Yet Brazil nuts have been shown in multiple studies that they can vary in their selenium content by up to 1,000-fold. And we know that too much selenium is as bad as too little. It actually prevents the cancer protective effects and increases our diabetes levels.
Wow.
We also know that Brazil nuts are high in barium and radium. And while they're fine to be eaten in moderation, they should never be eaten daily, and they shouldn't be a regular part of anyone's diet. The same with iodine. We know seafood, especially seaweed, is rich in iodine, and you often see kelp supplements for iodine. Even if the kelp supplement says how much the iodine is in it, they cannot guarantee it. And we know studies done on iodine products on the shelves which say how much iodine is in it have differed by as much as 944% in content. And just like selenium, too much iodine can cause thyroid issues as well, so it's as bad as too little. So we're strong advocates of the diet of a whole diet, and complete diet usually always beats supplementation, but we have to use science to our advantage, and when it does present us with information like this, we need to use it, and it just shows how a small bit of information can be dangerous as well. So yeah, for selenium, there isn't a diet we get around, it has to be supplemented, and it's the same for vegans and vegetarians and pregnant women for iodine. they should be supplementing iodine. They shouldn't be looking to be taking seaweed as their source of it.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that point for us there, Aidan. And I guess that again goes back to the key point that quality is better than anything else when it comes to the foods we're eating, the supplements we're taking, and we need to make sure that what we're actually putting into our bodies is doing the right things in the right ways. And that's something that people need to really be aware of, that just because you're taking a supplement doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't contain things that it shouldn't, that's going to have contraindications, and that it's in a form that your body can actually utilize. So just as a tie-up then, Glen and Aidan, thank you once again for your excellent messages there. The book really is worth a read, everybody. So as I said, you can buy it either directly from us at Igennus or through Aidan and Glen's website, the healthuncut.com or the Health Delusion. They are available through their website, and there's lots of really interesting articles on their website as well. They're also going to be doing some more webinars, hopefully with us throughout the year, as well as some guest articles appearing on our website at Igennus. One, I believe, has already been posted today, so you can all rush off and go and read that. 3 lucky participants will be given a free copy of the book, so keep an eye on your emails just to find out whether or not you'll be receiving one of those in the post. And thank you all very much for attending. Thank you for your excellent questions, and we hope to see you all again very soon on one of our Igennus Healthcare Nutrition webinars. Take care, everyone. Have a lovely evening, and the best of health and happiness to you all. Goodbye.